All right, my name is Ron Bailey, and I have been a residential roofing contractor for nearly 5 years now. So I'm just going to hit on some roofing basics today. Today's topic is going to be decking. So super excited to talk about decking. There is a bit more variety than you may think. The topics I'm going to be covering: when roof decking is damaged, when it needs to be replaced, the different kinds of decking. You have plank decking, 1x6s up to 1x12s, versus your standard decking now, which is your plywood, your OSB, your CDX. I'm also going to touch on H-clips, and then two big things I want to touch over is if you have to do a redeck, which can be pretty common, especially in the city of Atlanta on your older homes, doing a deck over versus actually removing the existing wood and then replacing it with new decking in its entirety. And then lastly, I'm just going to touch on battens. This is going to spread it into metal roofs a little bit, but I do think it is important to know because the way some sheds and other things like that are built, a lot of the times you may only see battens and there is no decking under there in entirety. Let's jump right in. When does roof decking need to be replaced? This may sound like a kind of an obvious one, but a lot of the times you can't specifically tell if it needs to be replaced without actually taking a peek in the attic. The obvious ones are going to be when you rip off the shingles, when you rip off a metal roof, you look at the decking and what you're seeing is it's starting to rot. Or what's very common too is if you had something called CDX plywood, where it's essentially layers of plywood that are almost glued together. A lot of that stuff, if it's really old, I've seen the layers start to separate from heat and then the top piece chips off where it's not exactly rotten, but it is damaged to the point to where it's not going to hold those nails really well when you're trying to install those new shingles. So if that is the case sporadically throughout a whole sheet, it's definitely something that needs to be replaced. A tip you can definitely use when you're replacing plywood, most installers are going to know this, just know if they go to remove a vent or something like that on the roof where it's just a small opening that was cut in and you need to replace plywood, you don't have to replace an entire sheet. What you really only need to do is open that section up to the next set of rafters. So your rafters are anywhere from 16 to 24 inches apart. This is when you look up in your attic and you see the frame of your roof deck, if you will. Those are going to be the beams that are running down. They're going to be touching at the peaks. Those are your rafters. So all you have to do is when you're replacing plywood, you just cut it open to the next two rafters and that's perfectly fine. Bear in mind, make sure you're using at least 2 3/4 inch deck nails unless code in your state will dictate something otherwise. Now let's get into different kinds of planking. So number 2, roof decking. You can have what's called planks, which is super common on your much older homes. I always ask people, I like to double check in the attic, but if the home is 70s or older, there's a really good chance that they have something called plank decking. Plank decking isn't a bad thing. I want to be very clear. There is some plank decking that's installed great. It held up. There wasn't any moisture issues. The attic was breathing properly. It's still a solid surface to where you can go back and still install a brand new roof without having to do anything with it. Most issues what I see with plank decking is a lot of it's spaced, meaning when they went to install each plank up the roof decking, they had gaps in there where I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they're like, hey, if I save, 1/4 inch here, 1/2 inch here, by the time we get to the top of the peak, boy, we just saved a couple wood planks. So maybe that's the case. I don't know. But when you do have sporadic gaps, that's a big issue. Not only is it a code violation, anything bigger than an 1/8 inch wide gap sporadically throughout the roof decking, but as you can imagine, if you're trying to nail something down and it doesn't hit anything, it's going to be an issue. So different plank decking can be a problem on certain manufacturer guidelines. Sometimes if it's wider than 8 inches, they don't like to see that. However, if you don't have a bunch of gaps, plank decking is still okay. If you do have a bunch of gaps, you may need to do a deck over, or you may have to remove the existing and go back with something new. Before I get into that, what do you deck over with? Well, most homes, as you can see now, just by looking up in your attic, are going to be plywood, meaning it's going to be either OSB, which is essentially particle board, where it's a bunch of shredded wood that's essentially glued together, or it can be CDX. CDX is, like I explained earlier, it's just going to be layers of wood that are essentially glued together. One is not necessarily superior to other. A general rule of thumb we do is whatever is existing is what we go back with. So if it was a CDX decking originally and needs to be replaced, we're just going to go back with the CDX. If it's OSB, we go back with OSB. And just know plank decking is typically going to be a 1x6 or 1x8. So just know if you're ripping that off in the event you need to do a redeck, a plank is going to be, no wood is true 1 inch, so it's going to be about 3/4 inch thick. New decking only needs to be 7 16 inch thick. Is that going to give you less protection? No. It's essentially all you need. So just be wary if you are removing some that's thicker, going back with some that's a little bit thinner. It's perfectly okay. Just make sure it's at least 7 16 inch thick. Really quick, H-clips, they're called H-clips as hurricane clips. These are not code in a lot of states. I think it's a great idea to always install them when you're doing a home. Why is it important? So especially in your hotter states, like I live in Georgia, when it gets really hot in the attic, that wood's going to expand and contract. It essentially will breathe. And if the installer butts up all the OSB together, this is when you see a lot of buckling. So if you ever look at your roof line and you see it starting to look kind of wavy, if there's not an indication of a leak, there's a good chance it's not because it's rotten or if it's warped or anything like that. What happened is over time, there was no gap in between the decking to allow it to breathe. And when it's trying to bow or expand and it's butting up against something, it's just going to bow, and it could bow outward or it can bow inwards. So a lot of those dips you see can just be something that's aesthetic and not always something that necessarily has to be fixed. It certainly can be, but bear in mind you want to mark these areas before you tear the roof off, because once you're just staring at plywood, it's very, very hard to see where it was warped before. A lot of the times, I will side note mention, sometimes it is the rafter starting to sag. This is a much bigger issue to fix, but usually again, it's aesthetic. Unless a rafter's sagging a dramatic amount, like, a few inches over a few feet or something like that, it's usually not really a structural issue. Again, it's just the board starting to warp over time. Usually something I see on much, much older homes. Let's get into if you have space decking and it needs to be redecked. This is something I come across a good bit in Atlanta. Like I said, the homes are just generally much older there. We actually recently worked in a historic district where the homes were 100 plus years old. Every one of these had plank decking. Actually, one of them had half of it redecked and then the other half not, which I have no idea what that happened there. Maybe the budget wasn't there or what have you, but it's super important to not try and cheap cost here and not have it redecked. Two big factors why. Obviously, one I covered earlier, if you're not nailing down to something that's structurally sound, then it's not going to hold. There's a good chance the shingles can just blow off. Or what's also really important is you can't warranty it. The big reason manufacturers don't like to see this space decking is because it can't be installed properly, meaning if you were to ever have issues in the future due to this and a manufacturer rep came out and looked at the project and was like, well, this isn't solid sheathing throughout the decking, that's going to void your warranty. So it's something super critical to keep in mind. Now, let's get into deck over versus removing the existing and then going back with fresh decking. So we'll start with decking over. This is probably going to be the most common practice. Why? Because it's going to save cost and time. Keep in mind, if you're doing a deck over, it's really important to make sure any of the wood that is already there is still in good condition. Don't think just because you're decking over, nailing the rafters, that you can just leave rotten wood or anything like that. You need to make sure that you're replacing anything that's damaged before you do the deck over. The pros of the deck over is going to be you're not ripping everything off, so that you're not leaving the entire attic and home exposed. God forbid you have a pop-up shower or anything like that happen. And then two, it's going to save you on labor cost as well. Because if somebody's having to go up there, cut wood, and just lay out a whole new surface for the roof, it's going to be a lot less expensive than having to physically pull each plank off and then cut it, and then you're having to do the balancing act of only working on top of just rafters. So it's a little bit more dangerous and time consuming as well. The cons is it's going to add a little bit of weight to the structure. Just know it's never anything significant. I've never had to bring a structural engineer out and be like, hey, is this going to support this weight? The only time I would even consider it is if it's an older home where the rafters are maybe super far apart and there's already a lot of dipping. Then it may be something where you're like, hey, let me do some calculations, maybe get somebody out here to check and make sure it can withstand the extra weight. But it's usually not going to be a difference for most homes. Now, let's get on removing what's there and going back with existing. This is going to be, again, it's going to be kind of a flip-flop of the other one. So you're going to run a little bit more risk. You want to make sure it is a very dry day. There's no chance of pop-up showers because you're going to be ripping everything off. The home that I was talking about earlier, where half of it was plywood and then half of it was still plank decking, we had to rip off that existing planking and go back with plywood. So most of this attic was exposed for a good portion of the day until we could redeck the entire surface. Obviously, this is going to be keeping it a little bit more lightweight. And again, it's just really going to drive up that labor price because it's a lot more costly, especially for my roofing contractors, when you're putting estimates together, to make sure your crew's not going to charge an extraordinary more amount to do this additional work, because it's not as easy as just removing a piece and cutting a piece in. You're having to hand undo all these planks and then do a balancing act of cutting in new sheets while balancing on these rafters to making sure that it's actually cut, looks good, and is a nice finished product to be able to install the rest of the roofing system. Last thing I wanted to touch on is going to be your battens. I've even heard them called purlins. I don't think that's the right term, but I just wanted to let you know this is what I'm referring to. So battens are going to be most commonly used when somebody is doing a metal over shingle application. So if the shingles are in okay shape and somebody wants to upgrade themselves to metal and save a little bit of labor costs by not tearing everything down to the bare decking, this is where this would come into play. So battens are typically going to be 1 by 2 inch strips of wood. They're going to be laid out horizontally along the slope, and then you can just essentially put the metal panels right on top of that. You screw down to the battens. I caution doing this whenever we do a metal roof at Douglas Construction. We always tear everything down to the bare decking. Reason being because I want to make sure everything underneath those shingles is in structurally good shape. And also, 9 times out of 10, if somebody's getting a new roof, it's usually because the shingles are completely worn out. It's not because they're trying to just get another roofing system because they don't like the shingles. And code actually dictates you're not supposed to, if the material on the roof is already falling apart or nearing the end of its lifespan, you're not supposed to just cover it up, which is what I see a lot of homeowners do. I get it to save costs. Just know you always run the risk, if you just lay over, of potentially screwing down to something that's not structurally sound. It's already starting to rot. And then if you're not that homeowner in 10, 15 years, or maybe 30 if you put a metal roof on, when that new roof needs to be replaced, that's a lot of labor that you're having the next homeowner have to deal with, because you can't just do it again and again and again and again. Another thing I want to bring up with the battens as well is there was this home in Augusta that was a much older home too. And when it was originally built, they decided to save costs by not doing solid sheathing across the roof decking when they put this metal roof on. They literally sporadically put pieces of strips of wood. It wasn't even like a true batten, which is why the homeowner called them purlins, but they were like 1 by 6s sporadically throughout, laid out between the rafters, and it was just enough wood to put a metal roof on top of this structure. It was not solid sheathing, and lo and behold, when they did have storms, there was a good bit of leaks that were coming in the home. So when we replaced this metal roof, what we opted to do was remove the metal roof, remove what was there as decking, and then do solid sheathing throughout the whole. So we put OSB throughout this entire roof, went back with ice and water because it was a very low pitch roof, and then we put our metal panels down to make sure that he was actually going to have a metal roof that was going to last him for the long haul. So let me know in the comments if I missed anything that pertains to roof decking. I think I did a pretty good job covering just about everything I've run into so far, but I'm curious to see if you've run into anything different. So homeowners, roofing contractors, hopes this video helps. Thanks for watching, guys.